You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Small and white, clean and bright. This episode is brought to you by Edelweiss. Blossom of snow, may you bloom and grow forever.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I'm the host of the show, and my name is Steve, and Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the podcast to share with us all about a plant that is meaningful to them, and then I share with the guest about a plant that is meaningful to me, and through this process we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Before we meet our guest today, I want to talk a little bit about essential oils. I talk about this later in the show, and I was thinking, like, what are essential oils? Why do plants make them? And I guess the answer might be obvious, but just to clarify here, essential oils are compounds that plants generate for a number of purposes. They use them to attract pollinators. That makes sense. They use them to dissuade pests, which is also interesting. They can use them to prevent or ward off disease. One thing we talked about on the show in the past is allelopathy, when a plant makes the soil incompatible to other plants around it. Those are also essential oils. And there's a number of other reasons. So they're generally part of a plant's reproductive system, part of their immune system, and just really amazing chemicals that plants create. And that reminds me of a subsection of chemistry called natural product chemistry. And this is the idea that plants are actually these little factories creating really cool compounds, really novel compounds that'd be really hard for a human to come up on their own. And so there's a whole class of chemists who look to plants for interesting chemicals. They isolate them, and then they figure out how they can make them, in the lab, which is pretty interesting because, there's so many chemicals out there. And if you were just trying to do it in the lab without any help from plants, I think it'd be really hard. So a lot of really interesting compounds that we use every day have their origin in plants. So that is pretty cool. And with that, let's meet our guest.
Better living through chemistry.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
Yes, I do. I have a plant that's near and dear to my heart. It's Daphne Oreomarginata.
Daphne Oreomarginata. I have no idea about this one.
Well, let me look
I've
up
heard
the
of
common
Daphnes
name.
before, I think. I think, right?
Uh-huh.
Daphnes, but I don't even know what they look like.
They are shrubs. They're low shrubs. Really, I should have said Daphne odora Oreomarginata because that is the genus and exact species of what we're talking about here. I don't, because this sounds like a brag, but it's not. I don't know my common names as well as I do my botanical names because I am a professional gardener. So,
well, when we get to my plant, I'm going to challenge you with a scientific name first. There we go.
Okay.
I'm going to put your money where your mouth is there.
Well, I don't know everything, but
okay, it's fine. It's fine. I like to throw curveballs to the guests sometimes. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
No, that's fine. So I think it's just Daphne. Actually, here I'm looking it up. It's variegated winter Daphne.
I see. I just looked it up. So Daphne odora is the genus and species, and Oreomarginata is the cultivar
name. Yes.
Cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's pretty.
But it's yes, isn't it? And the variegated part is kind of the key in the common name, variegated winter Daphne, because it's a really beautiful, it's evergreen, I would say, in zones, maybe 7 or higher, maybe 8 or higher, and then it'll lose its leaves in lower zones, 5, 6. But it's evergreen where I am, which is in the Pacific Northwest, and in March, it depends on how the weather is, but it in early spring it blooms, and so it's blooming before just about everything else.
Oh, wow.
Maybe it might go like forsythias and maybe camellias and then daphnes.
Mm.
I might not have that exact order, but like it's right around that time, the earliest blooming shrubs. And the coolest thing about it is it is so fragrant that it'll
Ah.
knock your socks off. I mean, it's strong. Um, and well, one of the reasons, okay, so it's just a stellar plant, just all around. But one of the reasons it's special to me is because when I was in horticulture school, now this is this is going way back, like um, several years here. But I was in class one day, and at that time, my husband was sick. He
Mm.
had cancer. He had colon cancer, and
Mm.
he had stage 4 colon cancer.
Wow.
And by the way, he's fine. And
Okay.
yeah, he's been
Good.
fine for
Ooh.
like over 2 decades now.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Wow.
Yes. So
Wow.
it's a
That's a. I mean, gosh. Wow. That's really amazing.
Yes, it was very intense. And we never thought he was sick. He was seriously sick because we were in our 30s at the time, and we never thought he was sick, like in
Mm-hmm.
that serious way. So like we just kind of went on without him really ever, like, he didn't address his illness for a while because we didn't ever think he had cancer. So anyway, he had to go undergo some serious chemotherapy treatment. He ended up having 2 surgeries, etc. So
Mm-hmm.
I was already in horticulture school, and I almost dropped out because
Mm.
it was so intense. But the good thing was horticulture school at that time was very it was the only place I could go where I could be myself, just me as myself without thinking about what was going on with us and my
Mm.
husband. Like everything, my life was, of course, I was overwhelmed by being a caretaker for him. I was overwhelmed by, the idea of losing him. It was just crazy
Yeah.
intense. But when I went to horticulture school, it was a time where I could set that all aside and just like focus on the little things, like identifying plants. And so I was in class, I was in a plant identification class one day, and I was looking. We had just stopped. We were at the zoo. We were at the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle, just looking at the grounds because we would go out in the field and study plants, and you would take notes and talk about them. So we had just studied this Daphne, and it smelled so great. And oh, okay, now I'm gonna try and I'm gonna try and tell this part without getting choked up. But this woman came up to me who was a fellow classmate, and she was like, "Hey, um, I heard what's going on with your husband, and I just want to tell you that I can't believe how brave you are, and I can't believe you're doing what you're doing." So I lost it
Mm-hmm.
to say the least. Like when she said that, she was so like blunt. She just like came up to me and said, "I heard your husband's sick. I feel awful about it, and I want you to know that like I think it's what I just said." And
Mm-hmm.
and so she said, "And if you need anything, I really want to help you." And for her to tell me that she thought I was brave, I it was the last thing I felt like, because I was scared. I was
Yeah.
scared out of my wits at the time. And so I just started like crying, like right there. I didn't even know this person, right? I mean, I like knew her as a classmate. Her name was
Yeah.
Angela. So I knew her as a classmate, but I didn't know her at all. So then I'm starting to cry. And then she starts to cry, and we start holding hands, and we're standing there, and the whole group went on, to the next plant without us. And yeah, I was trying to speak back to her, but I was so choked up, and I was saying, "No, I'm not really that brave." I just like lost it, and I unloaded on all I'd been feeling.
Yeah.
And she was like totally there for me. And it was just amazing. And I will never forget it because, sorry, I'm getting choked up. My voice
Sure.
is,
Yeah.
but I will never forget it because the Daphne smelled so sweet and fragrant and strong. You know what I mean? How you have a sensory memory, like, with a
Yeah.
scent.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is she and I ended up chatting. Then we continued on, kind of, we hung back from the class. I remember we went in the aviary, and like, you know how, like, after you weep, you're just sort of like, you feel kind of at peace and rest. We went
Hmm.
in the aviary, and it was so beautiful because the birds were like swooping around, and our class had, like I said, gone ahead, and it was very quiet. And it was such a special sort of, whatever it was, 20 minutes, that I just don't think, I mean, I haven't ever forgotten that memory. And that woman, Angela, is like one of my best friends now.
Wow.
So she and I ended up partners in horticulture crime because after we both got our certificates, she became a container designer and I became a garden designer. And we helped each other on each other's jobs from time to time, and we helped each other on each other's gardens. So she would come over, and we still do this, but sometimes it's a little bit harder nowadays to find the time. But we both go over to each other's yards and help each other work on our yards, because we each have this idea that we're going to have dream gardens or something, which is, we're fooling ourselves, but we keep trying. So ever since then, we have been like thick as thieves and super close, and done all kinds of crazy things like move boulders and dig out 15-foot shrubs and do
Amazing.
all kinds of silly things. So anyway, so my emotional connection to Daphne is what from the birth of that friendship.
Very wow. That is just an amazing story, and I think, I mean, doing this podcast for such a long time now, it's always surprising how strong people can have connections to plants and like an emotional connection. But that was a really great example. So I have a few questions. One, when you smell that Daphne now, does it bring you back to that? And is it like what is it like when you smell that particular Daphne now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I've grown probably three or four different uh, cultivars of Daphne,
Hmm.
and it's now it's just a fragrance I love, but it does no, it's not. I guess because Angela and I have so many new memories that it doesn't really trigger me back to that particular moment. But I
Mm.
will say that it always makes me viscerally happy,
Yeah. Wow.
and just I think that there's a real positive emotion connected to that smell for me.
Wow. That's really amazing. Uh, the other thing I think that you said that I really keyed into that it's, I think, probably really heartening for the audience is that uh, two experts in horticulture still don't have dream gardens, and that's probably okay.
Yeah, totally.
I think we all have like our insecurities about our gardens, and yeah,
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say we're both really close now, but it's been like, what, like a long time, like almost 2 decades. So, like it's we're almost there. But yeah. But and also too, things die or you have a harsh winter and you have to make adjustments and whatnot. So it's a constant work in progress. Even if you do finish your dream garden, you're gonna have to edit it, from year to year and make little changes and stuff.
yeah, wow. Well,
So
what a really beautiful story, and thanks for sharing that. Let's transition maybe to a little bit more about the plant. Like I said, I don't
yeah.
really know much about Daphnes at all. At all. What's the deal with them? What are some fun
Yeah.
facts and dazzling details about this plant?
Yeah, yeah. Well, they're so great. They're a low shrub. They usually don't grow much past 4 feet. So they're a good shrub to be not at the front of the border, but sort of maybe secondary right behind some perennials. They are woody, and they have sort of whorls of green leaves, or in the case of this variegated one that I love, it's green leaves with yellow margins.
Mm.
Um, and then
And
the
variegated, that
the
word variegated, I kind of understand what it means. It essentially means like some different coloration on the leaves or something like that.
yes,
Okay.
right, yes, and like yellow and green, white and green. In terms of hostas, it could be blue, lime, yellow, and green. It could
Aha.
be multicolors. Variegated meaning the foliage is variegated in its color.
I see. Cool. Thanks for clarifying that, because I just know that something you hear about houseplants. I know it had to do with different colors. I know that the houseplant people are like, the variegated ones are the ones that people really get into.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And sort of a fun fact is variegation happens from a plant having a virus that becomes
Mm.
stable, and then
Whoa.
they're able to reproduce it with that. I maybe there might be argument about how harmful it is, probably not, but by that variegation becomes stable, and then they're able to reproduce it.
Wow.
Um, yeah, I don't know if that's for all plants, but I know that that's for many.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that how that's where it stems from?
Oh yeah. I think
But
I remember reading something about was it tulips? I think in the Michael Pollan book,
uh-huh.
Botany of Desire. He's talking about the
Yeah.
tulip trade in Amsterdam, and I think how they got all those different. Maybe this isn't variegation, but all the different like intense patterns of the colors of the tulips, I think, had to do with some
Mm,
kind of virus thing. But anyway,
yeah, maybe.
audience, Google it. I'm not if we're not exactly right on that stuff. I'm not a yeah,
Yeah.
but fascinating. Something
Yeah,
to look into.
yeah. Yeah. So and there's several varieties. There's sorry, the variegated winter daphne, which is the one I'm talking about, is very pretty. It's deep green leaves with yellow edges, yellow on the margins, and that um, has little white star-like flowers with a pink blush. It's so delicate and so pretty. It looks, if you look at it really, really closely, it almost looks tropical, like a plumeria or something. And they bloom in little clusters of these white flowers. And the plant is off, if it's happy, it's often covered in them. So, oh, that's another great thing about Daphnes is for in terms of fragrant shrubs, because they bloom in winter, you're often not really in winter, in early spring, I should say. You're often caught off guard, like all of a sudden you're walking maybe from your car to your house and you go, whoa, what is that smell? Holy cow, what is, oh, the daphne's blooming. You know what I mean?
Cool.
Like,
Yeah, that's cool.
because it happens in a time of year that you're not really thinking about plants blooming and fragrance and any of that.
Yeah, because a
So
lot of
it's
those early bloomers actually aren't super fragrant, right? Some of the ones that look pretty, like forsythia, for example. We got a lot of
right,
forsythia, and
right,
that pops really bright, but it doesn't really have a smell,
right.
at least not from a distance.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so you're not really prepared for it.
yeah.
And so what as a designer, what I always recommend clients do is plant your daphnes somewhere where you walk almost every day. So in other words, if the conditions are right, plant it by your driveway. I have one by my drive. I have two actually by my driveway, one on either side. And or plant it by your front door. You could plant it in containers by your front door. Plant it somewhere where you will walk every day, so you can enjoy it every day, and so you can get just a moment of fragrance in the few minutes that it takes you to walk from your car and go into your house. So anyway, there's the variegated Daphne. There's another one called Carol Mackey, and Carol Mackey is kind of like the grand dame of Daphnes because that's like a British cultivar that was grown in a lot of old English gardens, and Carol Mackey is hardier than say the
Mm.
variegated Daphne. Carol Mackey is I think hardy to zone 5.
Ah,
So if you don't know Daphnes or you live maybe I don't know what Washington D.C. zone
I
is, but
think
if
I'm
you live in
technically zone 7A.
okay, yeah. If you could live in like in Chicago or zone 6 or whatnot, a Carol Mackey would be good to try because I think it would winter over just fine. You can do extra mulch to keep it happy, and also it likes really good drainage. So you don't want to put it in any kind of heavy clay soil.
Mm.
Having said that, Daphnes can't be transplanted
Mm.
very easily. They get very fussy about that, and they will wilt on you and blame you and look at you like very, very upset. for weeks. They
So
may not
what's the
die.
way to start them? Are you starting from seed? Or are you starting from a cutting? Or how do you
I,
get them going?
no, I never tried to grow them from seed or a cutting for that matter. I've always bought them from the nursery. And
I
when
see.
I take them out of the pot, I barely touch the roots at all. And this goes against what I usually do because when I take plants out of a pot, if I'm, planting for a client or whatnot or myself, I always loosen the roots,
Hmm.
always.
Hmm.
Especially the more pot bound it is, the more I loosen the roots because
That's
those
very
roots need to
relevant.
spread, right?
Relevant advice for this podcast, root band.
Yeah, right, exactly, root bound. So, with Daphne's, I don't do that. So with
Mm.
Daphne's, I take it out of the pot like it's a piece of crystal, and then I like gently put it in the hole, talk nice to it, tuck it in with some rich loamy soil, and water it and leave it be. I don't mess with the roots.
Mm.
Now, having said that, I'm going to contradict myself here
Okay.
because there's one cultivar of Daphne, and it's called Daphne Eternal Fragrance. It's a newish cultivar,
I
which
love
is so,
cultivar names.
yeah, I know, right? Um, Sometimes they're kind of absurd, but this one is very
Sure.
poetic.
Yeah. Eternal
Eternal Fragrance.
fragrance sounds
Yes,
like a
exactly.
yeah.
Right. It's like a perfume.
Yeah.
But it is like a perfume. And
Yeah.
the thing about this Daphne that's different is that it blooms uh, over and over again. I shouldn't say continuously because it may rest for a couple weeks and then bloom again. But usually
Mm.
Daphnes bloom one time, that early springtime of year. Well, Eternal Fragrance blooms multiple times in the growing season.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's awesome. And it's got bluish leaves more than green, which gives it also a cool kind of texture, visually. And the other thing I'm going to say about this, which contradicts what I just said, is I have moved my eternal fragrance probably 3 or 4 times, and it's
Mm.
done just fine.
Interesting.
I know.
Good cultivar.
Uh, people might get at me and be like, "What? You're crazy!" That like because they have a reputation for not transplanting easily. But for some reason, and it's only been the eternal fragrance cultivar, not any others, I have been able to transplant that thing and make it happy. Also, of course, when you transplant, you want to disturb the roots as little as possible.
Hmm.
And like dig out the whole root ball as much as possible and not break any roots. And then have your hole ready to go and not plant it too deep and not plant it too high. And if you can do that, I think you could be successful, at least with eternal fragrance. So, um, so I guess those are some fun facts about Daphne.
Super
Is
fun
that
facts.
is that
Absolutely.
is that
Absolutely.
what you're after? What else do
For
you want to
sure.
know?
No, that's amazing. A couple of other questions. Okay. One thing I'm just having in the back of my mind now because I listened to it on another podcast about I think they're talking about the fact that they're perennial, but maybe they have a shorter life than some shrubs. Am I
Yes.
remembering that? So you have to like plant them. Maybe I don't know. Tell me about that. I that stood out to my mind in another podcast. That's like the only thing I have in my mind about Daphne's, but I think you could fill in better.
Yeah, that's true. But having said that, I've had one Daphne probably for like, I don't know, 15 years and
Mm.
it hasn't died. But I have heard that. I mean,
Hmm.
I've read that I have not personally experienced that. I should say that. But I do know that that is a thing about Daphnes, is they are shorter lived shrubs. But if they are a shorter lived shrub and yours passes away, then that gives you an excuse to go to the nursery and get a new one.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. The other thing, I don't know if you have anything about the name Daphne. Isn't that like some Greek thing?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know. Let me look that up. I mean,
Yeah.
Daphne is, I
So
want to
it's a
say it's a
Greek
goddess,
character. Yeah, I think so.
right? Is a Greek goddess? Let
Yeah.
me see
Real time
here.
Googling here, audience.
Sorry, people. Sorry.
It's
Um,
okay.
Daphne is a tree. It says
The
a
nymph
Greek.
Daphne.
Yeah, right. Okay, a tree spirit and daughter of Peneus, the river god. Um, Yeah, I don't know too much about that, but it looks like, oh, this makes sense. Daphne is the nymph associated with fountains, wells, springs, streams, brooks, and other bodies of fresh water.
Ah.
So that's what that's about, I guess.
And then I'm
Um,
guessing the odora part probably has to do with the fact that it smells good, I guess.
yep,
That's just a guess,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, the funny thing about Latin botanical, maybe you already know this, but Latin botanical is just Latin words that sort of mean, you know, the word that it is, like odora, I'm trying to think of other things. Glauca means blue, or
Mm,
waxy, sorry,
mm,
waxy.
yeah.
So they just are sort of Latin words that are actually very literal.
Yeah.
Um, Having said that, there are some Latin names too that are named after people, like
Yeah.
explorers and stuff like
Yeah, and
that.
then they just like throw
So
some weird Latin ending on the end to make it sound more
exactly,
Latin. Yeah.
right,
I've talked a
exactly.
lot about it on the show because some of them are so funny because it's like I really like the Latin names and like reading about what they mean, and sometimes it's like, well,
Hmm.
why is this plant called this thing? It's like, oh, it's just named after a dude. It's some guy
Exactly.
that Linnaeus liked a lot or something. So yeah,
Right,
yeah.
exactly. Like there in the Northwest, we have a whole, I don't know how about a whole suite, but at least two plants that are named after Arthur Menzies. So
Mm,
he was a famous like explorer, rich dude who went around and who kind of helped do a lot of labeling of plants and whatnot in the Pacific Northwest way back when. And so he Pseudotsugo menzicii and Arbutus. Um, oh, sorry. Yeah, Arbutus menzicii are both named after Arthur Menzies, and that is the Douglas fir, which is the
oh yeah,
classic
okay.
tall Northwest tree, and then the Madrona tree, which is the broadleaf classic Northwest tree or West Coast tree, I should say. So
I
yeah.
knew I had heard that before somewhere, and then the Douglas was the Douglas fir. The Madrona is something I was not aware of until relatively recently because of a podcast we both listened to. But we
Uh
won't go
huh.
down that rabbit hole.
Right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
it looks like a really cool tree. I want to if I'm out on that coast at some point, I really want to track it down. Um, any other fun facts or
Yeah.
dazzling details about the Daphne that we missed?
Well, I was just going to say this actually about the Madrona tree.
Hmm.
The Madrona tree was a close second for me in terms of picking my favorite plant because it is such a fascinating tree. It's a broadleaf tree, so it's not an evergreen. It doesn't have needles. It has leaves, which are kind of very thick and sort of rubbery, but it's evergreen. And then it has this really cool reddish bark that peels. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, it's such a cool tree. And when you
It
see huge stands of them, it looks almost tropical. Like you don't even know what you're looking at. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
when I looked it up, and it makes sense, I think geographically a little bit. But I didn't know there was as many or a tree like this. But I was in New Zealand not too long ago, and a lot of the New
Uh-huh.
Zealand tree it reminded me of some of the trees in New Zealand, and they have a lot of
Mm,
broadleaf evergreen trees there. Like
uh-huh.
almost all of them are.
Uh-huh.
And so maybe there's some kind of like evolutionary. I don't know. It seems like in that classification of tree, because you're right, broadleafed evergreens are pretty few and far between.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
maybe that
There's
specific atmosphere that is similar in New Zealand and the Washington area kind of lends to that somehow.
yeah, like coastal, kind of warmish coastal rainy areas, I would
Yeah.
think. Although having said that, Madrona trees do not really like too much wet. They tend to rot in the Northwest. They like
Oh,
it
interesting.
hotter. They like to
Interesting. Oh, they're a
bake.
little further south than.
Yeah, they're more. You see big forests of them like in Northern California, Southern Oregon, kind of like
Mm,
around there.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Interesting.
but yeah, you're right. Broadleaf trees are not common. I mean, like you have magnolias,
Mm-hmm.
you'll have laurels,
Mm-hmm.
but not very many.
Like,
Yeah.
but yeah, big broadleaf evergreens. I was talking about that on a podcast not too long ago of because there's these different there's three words that separate trees that kind of end up putting them into just two groups, but there's this weird overlap, and that's evergreen versus deciduous, broadleaf
Mm-hmm.
versus conifer, and hardwood
Mm-hmm.
versus softwood.
Mm-hmm.
But but they're not exactly two different groups. Each one of those
Right.
definitions kind of has this interesting blending, which is interesting.
Right. Like,
Yeah.
for instance, the Douglas fir, like you said, is a conifer. It has needles, but it's a softwood tree.
Yeah. Well, most evergreens are softwoods.
But what about cedars?
Cedars are also a softwood technically. So that's the other whole
Oh,
rabbit hole.
okay. That's news to me.
Softwood has more to do with. I'm blanking on this now. I said it in the intro of an episode a while back. It has something to do with the cellular structure more than the actual
The actual.
hardness. So the
Oh,
cedar
okay.
is very hard,
Okay.
way harder than some hardwoods, but it's still
Got
technically a
it.
softwood. And on the other side of it, balsa is technically still a hardwood, even though it's one of the softest woods known.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go. Thank
Anyway,
you.
I love going on tangents. So that was a fun tree tangent on this episode
Yeah,
about
sorry.
Daphnes. It's totally fine. I love it. But yeah, on the Daphnes,
Um,
anything we missed, anything the audience needs to know about Daphnes before we.
They like part sun. The ideal conditions are like sun, maybe against an east wall of a house or east part of a border where they get morning sun and then they're kind of shaded for the hot sun. I have one that's on the western side of my house, but the way the sun goes, it's hidden behind trees for a good part of the day. So it'll get a blast of hot sun for just like maybe a couple hours, and that's it. So they only like some sun, but they don't want to ultimately like roast in the sun, you know? They want to be
Makes sense.
protected from a harsh afternoon sun. But having said that, you can experiment and see how it goes. I always encourage clients to say like, well, try it, you know?
Daphne was another of those independent, love and marriage-hating young huntresses who are met with so often in the mythological stories.
Well, thank you for sharing about variegated winter Daphne with me. Do you
Yes,
mind if I share a plant with you?
I would love to hear it.
All right, here we come with the scientific name here to see if I
Okay.
now it's a little bit not fair because first of all, even people who are experts don't know all these. This one's also a pretty weird word, and also I didn't do this on purpose, but I happened to pick a plant, a genus that there are 20 species, all native to North America, but only one that is west of the Rockies. Uh, so,
Oh,
so
okay.
you may have seen. I don't know about the one that is west of the Rockies. Maybe you know it, or maybe. But if you don't have as much experience with any, I don't know what your experience with East Coast plants is versus the West Coast. I don't know. Maybe people are planting this plant too in gardens because it is a very popular garden plant, at least out here, and there's a lot of people talking about it is used in gardens. So I'll say the name now. I'll get cut to it and see if you know what it is. It is now. Also, the pronunciation is tough, but it's either Pycnanthemum muticum or Pycnanthemum muticum.
No, I do not know that
I didn't.
that plant.
I didn't know that until the other day when I was looking it up. I know it by its common name, which is mountain mint.
Mountain mint.
You familiar with mountain mint?
No, I don't think I am.
It's a really
And
cool plant. Go ahead.
it's a is it a shrub or what is perennial
It
or
is
what is
a
it?
annual. I mean, sorry, it's a perennial. But it's not a shrub. It grows. I forget the form you call that. It kind of ends up growing in small stalks from the ground. It gets maybe maximum 3 feet high, but kind of they kind of grow in. They look like single plants, even though the root structure is a larger perennial structure under the ground. But it's
So
it's
it
yeah, it's
uh-huh.
a little bit like mint or other mints where like they have kind of single stalks, right? That grow, but in like clusters.
Uh-huh. So it's got runners under the ground and that's how it grows. That's very
Exactly.
mint-like.
It
Yeah.
is, and it is in the Lamiaceae
Uh-huh.
family, right? It's the same family as mint, but it's a different genus, and it's a genus native to North America. Um, and there's about 20 of them. The specific one I'm talking about is the one I'm growing in my backyard, which is called the Pycnanthium muticum, or sometimes I think broadleafed or clustered mountain mint.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna
You
look this up. Can
take a
I
look
look it
at
up
it. Yeah,
now?
please
Yeah.
do. Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
interesting. It doesn't look like mint at all. It's called mountain mint because it smells like mint and has a very strong flavor of mint, but the leaves are not super minty.
Right. So, okay, I guess I would say pycnanthemum. Pycnanthemum.
Pycnanthemum, yeah. And so that
I
name
think
means
so.
pike is from pykos in the Greek, which means dense, and then
Uh-huh.
anthemum is for anther, so flower. So it has dense flower clusters. And if you're looking at the
Mm-hmm.
pictures, the flower heads are super dense. They almost look like a compound flower, like they
Mm-hmm.
would be in the aster family, but they're not. They're like individual flowers packed super tightly. They kind of almost look like
Mm-hmm.
little buttons, which is
Uh-huh.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's right, the family is Lamiaceae. So, okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
And there is
that's definitely
one,
a mint. Yeah.
and there is a Pycnanthemum californicum, which is the only one that occurs west of
Okay.
the Rockies. The
Oh
rest,
yeah,
and
I see this. Yeah, they're all native to like in North Carolina,
yes,
Tennessee, Appalachia looks like, Virginia.
yeah, and apparently
Um,
North Carolina. The Wikipedia says the center of
yeah.
diversity is North Carolina, and 13 of the 20 species are found in North Carolina.
Hmm.
So it's a really cool plant. It
Have you grown
smells
it?
amazing. Yes, I have. I have in my backyard. When we bought
Uh-huh.
this house a number of years ago, um, I was trying to decide what plants I want to grow, and there's a pretty cool place that's in Virginia called Edible Landscaping. I'm getting a little bit. I'm growing a little bit beyond this, but for a long time, I just wanted to grow only plants I could eat in some way. I was
Uh-huh.
like really obsessed with that of like having, and I still pretty obsessed with that. But I'm starting to be like, no, what plants have other needs for other purposes, for beauty, for smells, for wildlife, stuff like that. I don't have to eat it all. But I
Mm-hmm.
was looking through both both the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange and then this edible landscaping for what kind of interesting plants I could grow. And basically, some of them like were more well known, but some of them were like, "That's something I've never heard of. Let me try it." And I read that there was this thing called mint, mountain mint. It's a native plant, whereas the regular mint, which is mint
Mentha?
piperita, Mentha piperita, right, is a European and Asian plant. So I was like, well, that's cool. It's a native plant. It'll be great for pollinators, and also I can make tea with it. So
Yeah.
let me try it. Um,
Yeah.
and I will say that I wish I have been using it more for tea. I end up like not drinking as much tea as I should, but it is a really good mint tea. It has got a very strong minty flavor. The smell's really really good. You
Hmm.
can use the flowers or the leaves for the tea. Um, it's really good. It's growing in a back corner of my yard. It's kind of interspersed now with some uh, mugwort, which is something I didn't plant on purpose, but they kind of grow well together over there,
Uh-huh.
which is a plant I haven't talked about on the podcast yet, but is also an interesting plant. But let's talk some stuff about this. On the tea, it is really good mint tea. However, just word of warning to the audience: there is indication that you shouldn't drink it when you're pregnant. So
Okay.
just so that there's some things like that. There is some indication that some of the varieties are higher in a chemical called pulegone, which is
Hmm.
the main thing in pennyroyal, which makes pennyroyal essential oil essentially toxic. Like pennyroyal tea is okay, but
Oh.
like pennyroyal essential oil can be almost all this chemical called pulegone, which is toxic. But as we say on this podcast all the time, quoting the famous Swiss alchemist Paracelsus, the dose makes the poison, and things that can be toxic if you take an essential oil are not toxic in a tea. So, from my understanding, and I've drinking the tea before and I'm fine, you're okay. But there is, a warning to women who maybe pregnant. So just I like to make sure that's clear out there. But other than that, it's a very nice mint tea. There's lots of traditional use, and there's not a ton of like really hardcore documentation at it, but it's understood that it has lots of use as a diaphoretic, which means to help with cough, help with fever, all those things that teas do. I think as far as like
Mm-hmm.
how people use them. But yeah, it's a great tea. It smells wonderful. I just made some today. I meant to have a cup when I was up here, but I was boiling it with Elise, and the whole house just smelled amazing because of this
Mm-hmm.
mint smell. And it's a little bit. I have to say, it's a bit more musky in its mint smell than
Mm-hmm.
the mint that we know because it's a bit more wild. I feel like the mint we know has
Mm-hmm.
been bred into a bit more simple mint over the years. So this one is definitely like a wild plant.
And can so if the oil has So I'm thinking, can you make mojitos with it? Probably
You
not,
could, yeah, I
right?
think you could because
Can you?
this Pouligone is also in mint. By the way, it's in anything. It's one of the things that makes
Okay.
something minty. It's just the
Okay.
level of it is
Okay.
slightly. Apparently, from what I understand, the highest plant that has this is pennyroyal. But people still drink pennyroyal tea. But also the same warning for pregnant women goes to pennyroyal tea as well.
Mm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
it's but if you concentrate the oil. It's just like if you just took pure caffeine, right? Like a cup of coffee
Mm-hmm.
is fine, but if you take a
Yeah.
shot of pure caffeine, right? It's just the manner of level. So I think you could make a mojito. It'd probably make a really great mojito. I should try that. I gotta use this plant more. I think is the purpose of talking about in this episode. Is I've made tea with it, but I haven't really
Mm-hmm.
explored the depths of how it can be used because but it is really cool.
Well, I mean, I was wondering about mojitos in particular because, when you use that mint in a mojito, you're grinding it.
Hmm.
So you're
Hmm.
releasing those oils. And so that's why I was kind of wondering if it was something that you could still do with
I
this
think it will be
mint.
small enough, right? It's all about the amounts. I went down this. I'm not going to get into it too much, but I went down a whole rabbit hole because I was reading one article that was about the essential oils, and they were saying the essential oil from the one I have shouldn't be consumed, where the essential oil from a few other species of mountain mint are okay. And I was like, oh crap, I have one that's bad. But then I was like, but people sell it for tea all the time. And then I was confusing. And I think that's a common thing that people make all the time. I was confusing the essential oil with the plant. And the
Mm-hmm.
percentage of the compounds in the plant
Yeah.
are way, 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 way lower than if you
Yeah.
have the essential oil. So,
Right. It's
right,
very distilled down in a really potent form, right?
right,
For the
right.
oils.
And so even
Mm-hmm.
though this one has a bit higher, it's true. It's still in any kind of way that you would be using it in a few leaves here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Totally fine. That same thing as what's the other plants? We talked about the same thing with sassafras. Sassafras I think is still technically illegal to
Mm.
use federally because of saffrole, which is similar. But as there's a really great Instagram personality. She goes by Black Forger. She wrote a song about sassafras. And she says you'd have to eat like a whole tree of sassafras and you're not going to eat a whole tree, are you? So it's the same. It's the same thing. But
Well,
yeah,
yeah, that
I went down this whole
that
rabbit hole looking up European guidelines for medicinal use, where they were talking about what the actual toxicity level of milligrams
uh-huh.
per kilogram of body weight of Poligone, and then I realized no. Anytime if it's not the oil,
Yeah.
you're probably fine. Like, don't drink 30 cups a day, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so
Yeah, well, that just reminded me of cinnamon. And,
mm,
cinnamon is a bark that is, fine to eat in cookies or whatever, and actually would kill you if you ate a whole, like, cinnamon stick.
yeah, totally. I forget about the name of the compound in that.
Or poison you seriously, I guess I
Yeah,
should say.
yeah. There's a specific. I'm blanking. There's just. I did a cinnamon episode a little while ago, and I
Oh,
talked about
neat.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah. So it's. I think like I said, the I think it almost is becoming the motto for the show, which is the dose makes the poison. This idea
Yeah.
that anything is poisonous if you have too much of it. It's just determining what too much is, and in some things, a little bit is too much. In some things, a lot of it is too much. But I did
Yeah.
really have this moment of like, crap. The variety I have is really high in this thing. Does that mean it's bad? But then I was like, but I bought it from Edible Landscaping. They sell things for edible. Like, I kind of spiraled for a second, and then I was like, oh wait a
Yeah.
minute. They're talking about the essential oil and so many things like that, where something is toxic, but it's because you're talking about the concentrated form, and so that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah. So do you grow mostly stuff that's like edible and has some sort of or has some sort of medicinal uses? What's your
Most
angle on gardening? What do you like to grow?
mostly edible. I'm not the medicinal thing is not. I feel like I don't really have the knowledge to like go down
Mm-hmm.
any medicinal rabbit holes. So it's more for
Mm-hmm.
just its use. I also am really into trying to plant native plants to this area, and if I had way more time, and energy, I would try to really transition my whole yard to being only natives because
Yeah.
that would be cool. And I've gotten rid of a lot of grass and replaced them with beds,
Hmm.
but there's still a lot of grass, and the grass is, all that grass is like weird invasive species that we brought over for grass, and getting rid of it is a huge challenge.
Oh, sure.
But yeah, I like the native. I particularly like the native plants that are abundant, that I feel like most people have no idea about. Mountain mint's a great one. It's like a mint. It grows really wild everywhere in the forest around here, and most people haven't heard about it. I talked about it, I think, in the last episode about Passiflora incarnata, the native passion fruit, which grows in this region. Right, it's a hardy northern passion fruit that I see all the time now because I know it. But most people are like, "There's a passion fruit that grows here." I've talked. I think another example of plants I like is the sunchoke, or also known as Jerusalem artichoke, which is a native sunflower that has an edible tuber, which is super super abundant, but most people don't know about it. I could go on and on, but that's what I like. I like those plants
Yeah.
that are native, but people kind of are not paying attention to them for whatever reason, but have really cool value. And this is one of those.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think. Do I have any more things about mountain mint? I think the only other thing I have is that, okay, two things. It's really, really great for native pollinators, which is something we really got to be aware of in the modern day so much. I was just talking with a guest a while back about how, we have tons of invasive species here. I think the Pacific Northwest has a lot of issues with invasives as well. And one of the main issues with invasives is that the native insects do not consume them. And so it's a bad for both the plants, but also the bugs. So this one is really, I found one study that I think it was in Louisiana that they did a really big assessment of plants and native pollinators. So it was like 20 different plants and a bunch of different bugs. And 68% of the bugs they cataloged were found on mountain mint. So it's, a popular amongst, at least in that area, amongst the bugs. And then the last little thing is, which is kind of funny. Well, I could go a little bit more. It doesn't really grow on mountains. It's called mountain mint, but it doesn't really grow in the mountains. I think it kind of grows in upland areas, and I was trying to figure out if someone just called a mountain mint because they were near a mountain, but they were lower. The guy who quote unquote discovered it, which is never the right term for a plant in this area, but is a guy who's pretty famous. His name is Andre Michaud.
Okay.
And he was like one of those guys who, like, some king in Europe sent him around the world to just catalog plants. It was like that time when there was a bunch of guys, probably like this Mincy's guy, similar dude.
Yeah.
And he was one of the ones who found that. But there's a lot of other plants that he cataloged, and also he was also responsible for bringing a lot of European and Asian plants to North America. And I'm blanking on some of the other ones, but the one that sticks in my brain, because we actually talked about him. I didn't realize we talked about him a long time ago because he's the guy who brought the crepe myrtle to the South.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, his name is Andre Michaud. He named it mountain mint, but probably in French. But why he decided to call it mountain mint and not like wild mint or something else is he found it in Pennsylvania, I guess. Its taxonomic history was pretty confusing. I'm not going to get into that either. But it didn't kind of settle onto the Pycnanthemum muticum until a little bit later. But he's the guy who's the first to document it, I guess.
So this is going to sound like a really dumb question, but do the Appalachian Mountains stretch into Pennsylvania? Do they go that far?
There's the tail end of them, I think, is in the. If I'm wrong about this audience, I apologize. There are definitely some part of that chain that kind of like trickles into like the middle south of Pennsylvania, but they may not technically be called the Appalachians then anymore.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry, audience. Sorry, Appalachians in the audience.
Well, I was just wondering because I was thinking, well, maybe he was there. That's where he was in Pennsylvania, like somewhere like at the beginning of the Appalachian Mountains or something like that.
And there are some mountains there, and maybe he just was Like I did read that they tend to grow on higher areas than other
Okay.
things, but not mountains, right? You think of something grows on a
Yeah.
mountain, you're like way up in the mountains.
Yeah.
So
Well,
maybe you can
even
see the
yeah.
mountains from them, right? You're on a hill and you can see. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I
The
mean, the
mint
one
part
that
is
was
clear though. They're total. It's very minty.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and what's a mountain out here in the West compared to what the mountains, like the Blue Ridge Mountains or
Oh
something,
yeah.
are very different. Like
Oh
they look
yeah.
like hills to us,
Oh yeah. For
because
sure.
they're they're softer and lower in elevation. But yeah.
Totally. Totally.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I don't know much about Eastern plants. I haven't spent a lot of time really. I was born and raised in Chicago, but I didn't really garden in Chicago. I started
Mm.
gardening when I moved to the Pacific Northwest. So I know more about like West Coast California and Pacific Northwest plants than I do, or even plain states or Midwest plants, prairie plants, than I do in East Coast and
Yeah,
about
that's
East
it's a
Coast
little
plants.
bit the opposite for me because I mostly grew up in California, but when I was like younger, I didn't really have much plant awareness, and so my
Uh-huh.
knowledge of like the plants out there, it's when I moved here and bought a house and started a garden that I really started getting
Yeah,
into it, and so very different.
yeah,
I had that realization, it's so different, but even when you're in the same zone, because the climates are so different, right? Like
yes,
humidity levels are just so different
yes,
between those, and lots of other
yes.
things that make what you can grow incredibly different.
Yeah, that's why Sunset Magazine for all those years had their own zones because they
Mm.
recognized that there are so many little mini climates
Yeah,
everywhere in the country that it's hard to say. Like my zone 8 is not the same as a zone 8 would be like maybe, I don't know, like in Texas or something like
yeah,
that. Like the
totally,
soil's going to be
totally.
totally different and the sun is going to be at a different angle and the amount of sun hours is going to be different, all that stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's all I have to say about Mountain Mint. But yeah, thanks for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Yeah, well, that was fun. I really appreciate it, Steve. Yeah, thanks.
Don't want a mint.
I thought okay, mint.
I gotta have the mint.
What a fascinating conversation with Karen about Daphne's and Mountain Mint. And I did a little bit of research, and here's the story of Daphne. And there's a little bit of an interesting twist here. So, just in short, the story of the character Daphne is that essentially at some point, Cupid decided to play a trick on Apollo because he made Apollo mad or something. And so he shot Apollo with an arrow that made him fall in love with Daphne. And then he shot Daphne with an arrow that made her scared of Apollo. And then as she was running away from Apollo, she begged to be saved. And I think the gods turned her into a laurel tree, not a Daphne, but a laurel tree. So it's pretty interesting that the plant Daphne is not actually a laurel. But I guess Daphne means laurel in Greek, maybe. But essentially, and I found this on a blog called The Wandering Botanist by Kathy Keeler. She describes that, I guess, Linnaeus is the one who called Daphne the Daphne, and there is a certain plant in the Daphne genus that is called spurge laurel in the common name, and it kind of looks like a laurel, and so that's why he named it Daphne, because it has similar characteristics to a laurel, those evergreen broadleafs like a Daphne. So that is, I think, why Daphne is called Daphne and not laurel. Convoluted story of namings. One last thing I want to bring up is that I have noticed that in Greek mythology, a lot of people get turned into plants. So here's a short list of characters in Greek mythology who were turned into plants and the plants they were turned into. So Daphne, we know, was turned into a laurel, not a Daphne. Narcissus was turned into a narcissus. It's like a daffodil-like thing. Hyacinthus, of course, was turned into a hyacinth, though apparently not the hyacinth we know. The description of the hyacinth in Greek myth is apparently different. Adonis was turned into an anemone flower. Mira was turned into the myrrh tree. Lotus, of course, the lotus tree, but that was probably a persimmon. Dryope was turned into the black poplar. Clytie was turned into a heliotrope. This was actually the first thing called a sunflower, very different from what we call a sunflower. And then Smilax, who was in love with crocus, they both turned into flowers and plants of those names. There's actually a lot more. I don't want to just keep going and going, but it was a very common thing. I guess that's how the Greeks decided to to explain the origin of the plants around them in their mythology. So that's super fascinating. And with that, let's end our show. Thank you for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Karen Hugh. Karen is an author and gardener. Her latest book is Leaf Your Troubles Behind: How to Distress and Grow Happiness Through Plants. You can learn more about Karen and all of her books at her website, which is KarenHugg.com. That's Hugg, if you're typing it out. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can help support the show, including just telling a friend about it. That'd be great. Rootbound is hosted by a guy who has not been turned into a plant, but that wouldn't be so bad. Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegesgota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, allow the scent of a flower to create a strong memory.
Edelweiss! Edelweiss! You look happy to meet me!